Okay, welcome to our 104, somewhere over 100 anyway, Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. We're very thankful to have a seminar this week, as there was a gap in the schedule, opened up due to my own changes in holiday plans. And so it was good that Mobolaji Alabi, who's here at the University of Reading, working on his PhD, was willing to step in and give a talk, a timely talk as well, as the Premier League returns. We have a talk by Mobolaji about two of the most successful teams of the Premier League era and two of the biggest financial weights of that era as well. So it would be very good to get your contribution, Mobolaji. Before you take your talk away, just a couple of administrative bits. I'm starting to turn my thoughts towards the autumn, even though it's the middle of the summer right now and wonderful weather. The autumn will come, or the fall, depending on where you're from, and we will carry on meeting. So if you do want to present, or you know of others that want to present in the series, please do get in touch. Be delighted to have your talks, whatever stage your research is at, other than if it's already published. I would like it to be unpublished. And we will meet up until around about the time of what we're organising in December, which is our second Reading football economics workshop. So you can see that on the screen, December 13th, 14th. Those are the 2 days of the World Cup semi-finals in Qatar. Obviously, we all hope that our team, our national team, makes it that far, so we'll see who will contest the semi-finals. But those will be the 2 nights of the second Reading Football Economics Workshop, December 13th, 14th. I'll put the link to the website in the chat, but it's another chance to come and visit us in Reading rather than only meeting via Teams. There's also a link here to where you can submit your abstract. So you can already submit an abstract for the conference. Please do if you would like to. Abstract deadline, still plenty of time for that, October the 31st. The exciting thing is we have our 3 keynote speakers now confirmed, although I need to refresh this because I've definitely updated this website. No, I haven't. Okay, I would tweet at least. We've got Cristina Philippou from the University of Portsmouth. We've got Jorge Tovar from Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, and Justus Hackap from the Heinrich Heine University of Düsseldorf, who will be our keynote speakers for the event. So looking forward to that. But in the meantime, we've got a fantastic talk ahead of us today. Mobolaji, please do take away your slides. Mobolaji's talk is entitled Pathways to On-Field and Off-Field Success in Football, a case study of Chelsea and Manchester United.
You can see my screen.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay. Still clear, right?
Yeah, we still see it. Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining, and thank you so much, James, for this opportunity to share or to present this paper. And it's a working paper, so I'm really looking forward to comments, questions, and comments that would lead to me to making the paper much better. So the title of the paper is Pathways to On-Field and Off-Field Success in Football, a case study of Chelsea and Manchester United. So I'll start that way. Just give me a second. Yeah, so it's a working paper for my PhD, and I'm supervised by Dr. Andrew and Linda, and they have been very, very helpful with comments on the paper and its developments. So the structure of the paper of my presentation today would be looking at an introduction, literature review, methodology and data, and I'll move on to case study discussion and conclude the paper. A bit of background. Manchester United and Chelsea are the case study subject, and there's a lot of reasons as to why they are the case study the two clubs that I've chosen, and I'll just give a bit of a background. On the 10th of March, as we all know, the United Kingdom's government sanctioned Roman Abramovich, who is the Chelsea owner, because of his close links with the Russian government. And he had purchased the club in 2003 using money from his personal wealth. And that was actually the second purchase of an EPL club by a foreign investor. The first was Wimbledon. Chelsea had only won about 10 trophies in 97 years. And by 30th of May, as a result of the sanctions, Roman Abramovich was forced to sell Chelsea to a consortium of American investors, or rather American and Swiss investors, led by Todd Boehly for about 4.25 billion. Roman Abramovich had bought the club for about 120 million in 2003. None of the proceeds of the sale went to Roman Abramovich as a result of the sanctions. Manchester United. So on the 2nd of May, 2001, fans of the club broke into the club's stadium at Old Trafford to protest the ownership of the club by the Glazer family. And the Glazer family had purchased Manchester United in 2005 through a leveraged buyout, which, the total fee was about 790 million, which was heavily financed by bank loans. And that's actually why the club fans have, or rather that protest that happened on the 2nd of May, 2001 took place. And United was the third club that a foreign investor purchased. Prior to the purchase, Manchester United had won 46 trophies in 113 years. A significant, of course, it's quite obvious that Man United had been more successful than Chelsea prior to both clubs being taken over. As of today, the Glazers still own Manchester United. So that's a background as to why and motivation for this study. So both clubs have had, or rather the owners of both clubs have had significant battles to face, or have faced significant opposition in the past year and a half. Man United as a result of the fans, and then Chelsea because of the UK government sanctioning individuals from Russia that have close links with Vladimir Putin. So that's the motivation for this study. Another thing is that 19 years on from the takeover, Chelsea and Manchester United are the two most successful clubs in the English Premier League, and they have both won 19 and 18 trophies respectively. The real question that everyone is asking, actually, as we're even going, as the season is starting today, the real question is, what is the relationship between what goes on the pitch, off the pitch, and is there any interdependence in how things go on? So does a club have to be successful off the pitch to be successful on the pitch? Another question that we're looking to try to provide some form of guidance, or rather answers towards from this case study, is how have both these clubs performed on and off the pitch since the takeover? They're the two most significant purchases by foreign investors, and what has happened and what strategies have been employed by the owners to achieve the success of to achieve the success. So I'll just start off with a bit of a literature review, which I'll be looking at a few things that have happened. The real question is, why the EPL? So why did foreign investors kind of focus on the EPL? Because there was a lot of investment in the early 2000s in football clubs. So why was the EPL targeted? Since its formation, the EPL has become the wealthiest and most in-demand football league in the world. At about the early 2000s, because of the global demand for football, as well as specifically the EPL, and because of technological breakthrough, clubs needed more money in order to finance building new stadiums because of regulations, as well as having enough infrastructure to actually beam the matches to wide audiences. So a lot of them went into the stock market to raise funds for these capital projects. However, as a result of, the fact that a lot of clubs were loss-making beforehand, shareholders did not receive much dividends. For most clubs, it was zero dividend paid to shareholders. And because of those losses and non-payment of dividends, the share prices fell. And after the share prices fell, the funny thing that happened was, as share prices and losses were increasing, revenue was still actually growing immensely. In 1992, when the Premier League began, the broadcast revenue for 5 years was about 280 something million pounds. As of the last cycle is about 9.5 billion pounds. That's to show you the growth in revenue. And as a result of that growth in revenue and then the global popularity of the English Premier League, a lot of foreign investors swooped in to invest in the clubs, or rather to buy the clubs. And one of the reasons why they were even able to buy the clubs was because they were listed on the stock market, and all they just needed to do was to buy up the shares. And the fact that the clubs were loss making, investors, the premium on the shares were actually quite low. As of today, 14 of the 20 English Premier League clubs are owned by foreign investors. Okay. The next thing I'll be talking about from the literature is strategy and financial management in football. The objective of football clubs historically, most companies, the objective is to maximize profit, but football clubs are not your usual companies, and their objective is leaning towards win maximization. Even when the clubs got floated on the stock market, you'd expect that they'll move to profit maximization. However, there's evidence to show that necessarily did not happen. The study by Barrio and Simansky 2009 actually highlights this. What then happened, or what we started seeing, the fact that the objective of football clubs was win maximization. We realized that the reason why clubs became loss-making was because of the correlation between player expenditure and playing success. So the more you spend on player expenditure in terms of wages and transfer fees, the more likely you are to win on the field of play. And I mean, the literature is unanimous on this. And essentially, because of the fact that to achieve success and the fact that most owners were win maximizers, what we saw developing was a rat race. So everybody wanted to buy players to give themselves a better chance at winning. So inflation in terms of player wages as well as transfer fees began. And yeah, so this quote by Sloan, 1971, actually captures what happens at board level. And what he says is that discussion at shareholders' meetings tend to center on football. And the only time there's any conversation outside of football is actually, any financial conversation is actually tied towards how the club can actually get more money in order to sustain or in order to maintain or to achieve its on-field goals. Okay, this plot here shows wage expenditure and points, and it's a wage expenditure and points plot. And you can see here that as time went on, the circle and black circle dots as well as the yellow dots signifies the Premier League years and the Abramovich years. And you can see that during the Abramovich years, points and wages, there's a huge correlation there. I mean, this is not to say that it's just the Premier League being established or Abramovich buying Chelsea that caused this, but I mean, there are contributing factors. There are a lot of other factors that have caused the strong correlation between points and wages. So the next slide here, we're looking a bit more and going into some of the frameworks that have developed within the football finance literature around how clubs, or rather the interdependency between financing, competitive and financial management in the football industry. This framework was developed or rather made or rather adapted to football by Grundy. He had a similar case study, which is actually what we are trying to expand on, and his case study looked at a few clubs. And one of the things that he noted was how interdependent competitive strategy, financial management, and financial strategy is. For competitive strategies, how does a club want to achieve on-field success? For financial management, how do they manage the resources they have in order to achieve their competitive strategy? And financial strategy or financing strategy is how clubs are able to bring in new finance, external finance, in order to achieve their competitive strategy. So that's essentially the framework that we will be using here. That's for the diagram on the left. On the diagram on the right, or the figure on the right, or the flow chart on the right, just goes into a bit more detail as to what clubs do. Cash flow is a huge thing for in football, and it affects almost every single thing in terms of investing in players, security, interest and dividends, stadium investments. Grundy analyzed 4 clubs in his case study: Chelsea, Man United, Leeds, and Arsenal. And he had some very interesting findings that we'll be looking at. So his general conclusions from his study is that business models and financing performance can actually differ within the same industry. So you can have different clubs achieving success in different ways. And another important thing that he noticed was that historical context actually shapes the competitive strategy of football clubs. And financial performance, as well as financing requirements, changes over time. And it's the club's competitive and financing strategy plays a huge role. As a club's position in the industry can change quickly, because I mean you have competitors who are trying to get an edge over a club. The club has to be very, very quick in terms of changing its financing strategies, or in order to remain flexible. Lastly, one of the general points is that financial management can proactively suggest the need to change the financing and competitive strategy. So if a club, for example, notices that its bottom line is or its cash flow is not adequate to achieve its objectives quickly, they're able to change either how they're able to compete, or to change how, or rather to think about alternative ways to get funds into the club to achieve their goals. The club specific, so we have chosen 2 clubs, and I'll give reasons as to why we have chosen Chelsea and Manchester United, in addition to the background that I gave. One of his conclusions for Chelsea was that the club had bold commercial plans. So Chelsea had tried to set up what is called the Chelsea Village, in order to take advantage of the foot traffic in London, as well as the cosmopolitan area where the club was located. And despite signing a lot of foreign-based players, and I mean having a very flamboyant style of play, it didn't result in on-field success. And all this is prior to Roman Abramovich taking over the club. And the club had huge debt, losses, and negative cash flow, and they hardly sold players for profit. And Chelsea was in a very dire situation, and we'll see what happened just before Roman Abramovich took over. The fact that Roman Abramovich had taken over, one of the conclusions that Grundy had was that Chelsea was going to disrupt the competitive landscape because of the fact that he had unlimited financing. And of course, at this time, there was no regulation, financial regulation. For Manchester United, one of the things Grundy's study noted was that the club was historically successful, and because of their historical success, as well as an unfortunate incident that happened when the clubs during the Munich air disaster, that actually galvanized the club and their commercial activity, or rather galvanized the club in terms of its global fan base. A lot of people had a lot of attachment with the club because of the story of what had happened and the way the club was able to bounce back and establish itself as a European superpower. The club's commercial activity was boosting its revenue, and Man United was one of the few clubs that was profitable in the early 90s as well as in the early 2000s. However, the club didn't sell much, or rather didn't earn enough, considerable comparatively in terms of sale of players, and the profit was quite low. Another thing that he noted was the club had no debt. The club was in healthy the club's cash flow was very healthy. However, because of Chelsea's takeover by Roman Abramovich, one of the things he noted was that Man United might need to look for new financing in order to ward off the competition and to ensure that they are still the #1 club in England. After Grundy's framework and his case study, a lot of developments have taken place within the football finance landscape and the football industry. What we have seen is that, or rather between 2003 and 2011, we know there was significant investment in player expenditure. So player expenditure is transfer fees as well as wages. And in some cases, I think in 2009 or 2010, about 78 clubs around Europe had spent more than 100% of their revenue on just wages, excluding transfer fees as well as other costs. So there was an overinvestment in players. And the reason why, I mean, as I mentioned, there's a huge correlation between how much you spend on player wages and transfer fees and how successful you are. So a lot of clubs were overinvesting. Another thing that has come to fore in the literature is managerial turnover and its impact on on-field performances. And the literature, I mean, there are some strands of the literature that says that sacking a manager provides immediate reprieve in terms of there's the bounce, that happens from when you sack a manager and the team starts to play well, and I mean that managerial change can actually positively impact on-field performances. But other strands of the literature says that there's always a mean regression, or reversion. Reversion to the mean. So it's actually short-lived, that managerial turnover. But regardless of whether of its impact, it became very, very, very rampant. A lot of clubs sacked their managers once things weren't going well on the field, and the cost of managerial turnover became very high in between 2014 and 2018. Clubs in the EPL paid managers 130 million in compensation for terminating their contracts early. Another development in the literature is the role of the sporting director. The role of the sporting director has become very important in football in terms of, especially as a result of the managerial turnover that happens a lot. The sporting director essentially acts as a bridge between the board level as well as the on-field coaching team. So essentially, the sporting director generally is savvy in terms of finances as well as in terms of football. And in cases of managerial turnover, the sporting director, one of their roles is to ensure that the competitive strategy of the club remains intact. And so there's been a growing number of clubs that have adopted the sporting director role in their operations. Between 2016 and 2022, there was a growth in the EPL. So from 13 clubs having the sporting director or its equivalent, as of, I think at the beginning of this, at the end of last season, there are about 17 directors in terms of transfer negotiations. Transfer negotiations, and in some instances, sacking the manager. Another growth or development in the literature is corporate governance and financial fair play regulation. UEFA, as a result of overinvestment and high losses, or rather, high losses as well as high debt in European football, introduced a set of regulations called the Financial Fair Play Regulation in 2011 in order to. It was essentially a budget constraint that limited how much a club can spend on players, and it limited it to what the clubs can earn from revenue, in terms of revenue. And for over a 3-year period, the club is required to not make losses above 5 million euros. And yes, in terms of corporate governance, there's also been conversations as to how many board members is required, or rather, what's the ideal size of the board in terms of how a club is able to perform on the field. So should you have a large board or a relatively small board? So those are some of the developments in the literature. Okay. So I'll move on to methodology. So essentially, what I've tried to do here is just to look at what has happened in terms of Grundy's framework and what has happened afterwards, after his case study, what has happened in football. And that's what I've looked at, some of the developments in the literature. So I'll be moving on to the methodology. We adopted a mixed methodology dual case study approach, and this enables us to look at qualitative and quantitative information to capture unique insights into how football clubs have developed over the years. Our sampling is subjective. We have chosen these 2 clubs for the following reasons. The first top 4 EPL clubs to be acquired by foreign investors. The timeline of the takeover is very close. So 2003 for Chelsea, 2005 for United. The trophies won, the amount of trophies won, and the size of investment in acquiring players is very similar. And the ownership of both clubs has faced opposition over in the past year and a half. Leeds got relegated in 2003 or so, and that's one of the reasons that why we have excluded them. Arsenal has not achieved as much on-field success, so that's why we've taken them out. And their ownership has essentially remained constant over the years. All right, so our data is gotten from the financial statements of the clubs, their press releases, other publicly available information. Our data covers Chelsea from between 2003 and 2021, and United between 2004 to 2000. Actually, that should be 2005 to 2021. All right, so some of the early decisions that took place at Chelsea. So Roman Abramovich bought the club for £140 million in July 2003. And Chelsea was actually listed on the stock exchange, and they had a 75 million euro bond, and that essentially Chelsea needed to pay. And when he took over, he actually helped the club to pay this debt. And one of the first moves that the first appointments that he made was to sign, or rather to appoint Peter Kenyon as the club's chief executive. Peter Kenyon was actually Manchester United's chief executive before Roman Abramovich appointed him. And an early decision was the fact that he appointed Frank Arnesen as sporting director, and Marina Granovskaya was appointed as one of his trusted advisors. So the board size for Chelsea was about 7 in 2003, and by the time it took over, it had reduced to 4. For Manchester United, the Glazers took over the club in a deal worth 790 million, of which 595 was financed by bank loans, and the club was delisted from the stock exchange. There were a lot of protests to the takeover, and so essentially the protest that has started today, right, dates back to when the Glazers took over in 2005. One of the things they did was to retain Sir Alex Ferguson as the manager and David Gill as the club's chief executive. However, there was no sporting director appointment. The board size increased by 1, and from 7 to 8. However, 6 Glazers actually joined the board. So essentially, about 6 people were replaced, and then 1 extra person was retained. Sorry, 2 extra people were retained when the Glazers took over. Okay, so this is just a snapshot of our data. Sorry, James, I just want to ask, can you see the meeting icon? I hope it's just the screen that is showing, and it's just for me that I'm seeing a meeting icon. It's just the screen that's showing, right? Your picture isn't showing.
Your screen, yeah.
Okay, okay, fantastic. Okay. All right. So this is Chelsea's financial fair play on-field and off-field performance. There are a lot of graphs that are on the next slides, but I just want you to focus for this part of it on the non-financial information. The financial information, I have graphs that explains it. Financial fair play, Chelsea sacked about between 2003 and 2012, had managerial changes 5 times, and the average position that when they sacked their managers was actually when they were placed 3rd, and then the average points from 1st place was 10 points. So the final league position on average over the 9-year period is actually 2nd, and Chelsea won 12 trophies, more than 12 trophies in about 9 years, more than what they had won in their in the previous 97 years. It's essentially showing the impact of Roman Abramovich's investment in the club. Whose financial fair play, still yet again another 5 managerial changes, and the league position at sacking was 7th on average, and the points from 1st was 17 to for a large. For some reason, it seems as though Roman Abramovich post financial fair play was a bit more. He was a bit more. What's the word? He took a softer approach, The final league position for the club was on average 4th every season between 2013 to 2021, and the club won 7 trophies. Okay. For Manchester United, there were no managerial sackings between 2005 and 2012, and the final league position on average was 1st. Sorry, there's a mistake here, and the club had won a total of 12 trophies, 12 trophies between 2005 and 2012. Okay. Post financial fair play, the club had 3 managerial changes, and I mean, one of the reasons why there was no managerial changes between 2005 and 2013 was because of Sir Alex Ferguson, and the club had won 12 trophies, and then plus the last one, 13 trophies under the manager. So this managerial change actually was not as a result of Ferguson being sacked, but because he retired, and his replacement, David Moyes, was actually sacked in the same season. So post financial fair play, Man United has had about has changed their manager 3 times, sacked their manager 3 times. The average league position at sacking was 6th. Points from 1st was 18 points, and the average final league position is 4th. And the club has won 6 trophies compared to 12. So they have been half as successful post financial fair play. Okay, so I'll just be going through some of the revenue, or rather some of the financials, just to look at what has happened in both clubs. This graph here shows Chelsea's revenue between 2003 and 2021. The clubs, and it's broken down by source of revenue. Unfortunately, Chelsea's 2003 and 2004 accounts does not show this breakdown, so that's why it starts from 2005. One key thing that we notice here is that match day revenue essentially remained constant. However, because of COVID, the club's match day revenue essentially went to 0. Chelsea's commercial revenue increased or became more significant post financial fair play, but of course went or rather reduced during COVID. The club's broadcast revenue grew essentially almost every single year because of, and this is not necessarily only because of their on-field performance, but as a result of the fact that the EPL has become a global product that is in demand. But in 2020, Chelsea, despite COVID, their revenue shot up to a very high. It shot up in 2021, and this is because of their performance in the Champions League, winning the Champions League in 2020. In 2020. Yeah, in 2021. So their broadcast revenue actually went up significantly. For Manchester United, similarly, match day revenue has remained a bit constant. However, one thing that we notice is how significant their commercial revenue has become. Commercial revenue has grown much more than broadcast revenue, whereas for Chelsea, at every single time, commercial broadcast revenue was higher than commercial revenue. So this just shows that Manchester United has done considerably better than Chelsea in terms of growing the commercial side of the game. Yeah, and then Man United's broadcast revenue actually went up also in post-COVID, and this is because the club had actually returned to the Champions League, and then they returned to the Champions League, and I think they reached the final of the UEFA Europa League. So in comparison, Manchester United's total revenue, is significantly higher than Chelsea's, even though prior to, it started off a bit similar between 2005 and 2008, but Man United's commercial revenue growth essentially meant that their total revenue grew faster than Chelsea's. All right, so some of the notable revenue insights. Chelsea's stadium capacity has remained fairly constant with minimal increase in ticket prices, whereas for Manchester United, their stadium capacity increased by 8,000 seats in 2006, and ticket prices have marginally increased. Ed Woodward was instrumental to the club's commercial revenue growth. He was the commercial director between 2005 and 2013 when he became the club's executive vice chairman. All right, so Chelsea's main expenses. So the main expenses of most football clubs is wages as well as player transfers. One of the insights that we can see here is how wages has constantly grown since 2003. Player transfers, on the other hand, has, gone up and down a few times. But one of the things that we notice is that when COVID hit, player transfers actually reduced. And this is as a result of the uncertainty of the times. And clubs had to scale back, as well as wages also dropped a bit. And in 2001, transfers went up. Another reason why Chelsea's transfers went down significantly in 2020 is because Chelsea was banned from signing players in 2020 by FIFA, and I'll explain this in the next slide. For Manchester United, a similar pattern. Wages have also always gone up. But another thing that we notice here is that United's net transfer actually increased significantly between 2014 and 2020. That's because United actually spent more on trying to buy players post-Ferguson, or post the Ferguson era. In comparison, both clubs' wages, so this is just wage comparison for both clubs. It has been similar, but and then in a few years, Man United actually spends more than Chelsea. Chelsea's wage to revenue. Chelsea's wage to revenue before financial fair play came in was as high as 84%. But you can see that during the years of financial fair play, that's between 2011 and 2020, it significantly dropped, and that's as a result of the financial regulation. Yes, and another thing worth noticing is how the jump between 2003 and 2004. For Man United, wage to revenue has remained fairly constant, and before the Glazers, or rather, the highest that it was 55% before financial fair play, and it went down significantly post financial fair play. And of course, during COVID, went up to as high as 65%, the highest. But Chelsea, on the other hand, the highest was 85% in the year financial fair play was introduced. So it's clear here that Chelsea's wage to revenue percentage is much higher than Manchester United's. Profitability. Chelsea's profitability, they have had before financial fair play, they did not post revenue at all. Profits. But during the years of financial fair play, you can see that it kept on going up and down, and this is credited to the impact of financial fair play. So in a few years, because financial fair play is assessed over 3 years, so you can see that in some years Chelsea made a profit, and in some years they didn't make a profit. So essentially it balanced up because Chelsea has never been sanctioned. During COVID, Chelsea's losses went as high as 150 million in 2021. Okay, Man United's profitability. So Man United's profit has been fairly a profitable club. I've included net finance cost because this just shows how Man United's profitability was reduced as a result of the finance cost. That's interest on loans. So this just shows the comparison between Man United and Chelsea. And Man United on average has been more profitable than Chelsea. Okay, so other notable profitability insights. So Chelsea paid fines for terminating kit manufacturing deals. So these are commercial deals for their kit manufacturers. So they paid 25.5 million in 2005 and 69 million in 2016. And the reason why they actually terminated these contracts was because by the time they did, as they were more successful on the pitch, they felt they could get more from the kit manufacturers. That's Adidas and Umbro. So Umbro was in 2005, and then Adidas was in 2016. So by cancelling the contracts years early, they had to pay a fine. Also, Chelsea paid 12 million to Adrian Mutu in 2005 for cancelling his contract. And the reason why they cancelled his contract was that he tested positive for cocaine, and the club decided to pay him off. Another insight is that there was no dividend payment or significant interest payments at Chelsea. For Manchester United, there was significant interest payments to banks for loans. And this totals 728 million. And of course, this shows how their profitability, even though they were very profitable, they could have been much more profitable. Dividend payments began in 2016 and has totaled 122 million since then. So Chelsea's net transfer activity. So the yellow line is profit from sale of players, and then the blue line shows their net transfers. But one insight that we can notice is that Chelsea's net profit from player sales was fairly constant before financial fair play. But by the time financial fair play was introduced in 2011, it started trending upwards. And as it trended upwards, net transfer spent actually became higher. And this essentially is showing that in order to finance Chelsea's transfers, because of financial fair play limits what Roman Abramovich could introduce into the club as financing, Chelsea adopted selling players in order to finance transfer deals for improving their squad. So that's one of the things that we noticed here. In 2020, Chelsea earned over 100 million in profit from the sale of players, and that was actually in the year when they sold Eden Hazard to Real Madrid. For Manchester United, on the other hand, their profit from sales has remained fairly the same over the years. The highest amount they earned was for the purchase of Cristiano Ronaldo, or rather the sale of Cristiano Ronaldo to Real Madrid in 2009. But ever since, after that, it has essentially been the same. Their net transfer spent, you can see that in 2011, it became very high, but in this case, it's a negative. So a negative shows that they spent more, and they spent more between 2011 and 2020 compared to 2005 to 2011. And this is as a result, it's attributable to the fact that the club spent more post-Ferguson. So this shows the comparison between United and Chelsea. And so this is net transfer fee spent on players. And you can see that on average, before financial fair play, Chelsea spent more. Post-financial fair play, United, and post-financial fair play as well as post-Ferguson, United has spent more than Chelsea. Okay. So just to compare profit from player sales, and you can see that Chelsea's profit from player sales is much higher than Manchester United's. And Chelsea's profit from player sales actually increased more or rather after UEFA introduced financial fair play regulations. So that's essentially showing how Chelsea's business model changed as a result of financial fair play. Okay, so other notable transfer insights. Marina Granovskaya was instrumental in selling players for profit, and she was awarded the best director of football in Europe in 2021. There was also a transfer ban that FIFA issued against Chelsea in 2020. The significant transfer expenditure post-Ferguson, and one of the reasons, the possible reason is the fact that they did not have a sporting director, because sporting directors actually help to transition a club when the manager has changed. And the fact that they have spent a lot of money but not won as much trophies post Ferguson alludes to the fact that the club might have done better if they had gotten a sporting director. So Chelsea's debt. Chelsea's debt between 2004 up until 2021 essentially went up almost every single year. For Manchester United, on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, Manchester United had zero debt in 2004, but by 2005, when the Glazers took over, it went up significantly. In 2011, Man United's debt actually went down a bit significantly between 2010 and 2011, and I would explain why in the next slide. And then it started going up again between 2005 and 2020. Actually, I'll just mention between 2014 and 2018, or rather between 2004 when it started going up was when Man United went back on the stock exchange, or were floated on the stock exchange. All right, so Chelsea's debt is definitely higher than Manchester United's, and the trajectory has been upwards ever since. Okay, so notable insights from Chelsea's debt. So this is an extract from Chelsea's financial statement, and it says that essentially Chelsea put there that Roman Abramovich had committed to providing sufficient financial support to help the club achieve its on-field activities. And all the loans from Roman Abramovich did not have a repayment date. For Manchester United, the bank loans required the club to maintain an EBITDA of 65 million. So essentially, their earnings before interest and tax, depreciation, amortization. I mean, the restriction was that it couldn't go below 65 million. So the fall in 2011 was because of the repayment of a payment in kind loan with new shares. The further fall in 2012 was because of the club's listing on the New York Stock Exchange. There hasn't been significant repayment of the loans, but they have been restructured several times. So trade creditors is another important trend that we have seen. Trade creditors is essentially a club buying a player and not paying all the transfer fees at one go. And essentially, this is a way for clubs to maintain their financial management or to maintain their cash flow. And we notice here that between 2011 and post financial fair play, there was an upward trend in trade creditors. So essentially, clubs were using this more often. Same thing with Manchester United. It went up post financial fair play. Okay, essentially, Man United actually used paying for players in installments more than Chelsea. Okay, so the next slide is just looking at the themes on Chelsea's financing and competitive strategy and financial management. So Roman Abramovich financed the club's operations with interest-free loans, and it has led to on-field success, with the club winning 19 trophies in 18 years, compared to 10 in 116 years. There have been 13 managerial changes in 18 years, and a total of 110 million has been paid as compensation to those managers. But however, it has actually worked in a way because a trophy was won within 2 years of every managerial change. Interest payments are close to negligible, while there was no dividend paid. Another thing is that recruitment of players was quite high. About 951 million has been spent net, and then significant wages has been paid to players, and the average was 71% of revenue. Another thing is the fact that Chelsea's business model changed post financial fair play. Financial fair play restricted how much Roman Abramovich could invest in the club, and so what they did was to devise a way of selling young players who they had actually previously sent on loan, and then selling them for huge transfer fees. And this was the method through which Chelsea was able to finance their transfer activities. However, the low revenue from traditional sources of revenue, so there are traditional sources of revenue, match day income, broadcast income, and commercial income is significantly lower than their competitors. In fact, Todd Boehly actually mentioned that UEFA's new financial regulations, Chelsea has to be very careful, if not they'll get sanctioned as a result of the fact, and I mean, I am linking this to their historic operations. So for example, their stadium is still one of the smallest. Chelsea's commercial operations has not really blossomed as well as other clubs. So I think those are some of the areas that the new owners can actually seek to improve the club on. In fact, I think about 2.5 billion pounds of the purchase price by Todd Boehly is going towards, I think, the development of a new stadium. For Manchester United, the club was financed mainly through its operating cash flows, whereas bank loans formed a small fraction. Man United has won 18 trophies in 16 years, compared to 46 in its 129-year history. 13 out of the 18 trophies came under the period where Manchester United's manager was Sir Alex Ferguson. So essentially, post-Ferguson, there hasn't been much success. The 595 million bank loan used to purchase the club has been restructured several times. So that's another theme we've seen: restructuring of loans, as well as interest and dividend payments. The club has been floated on the New York Stock Exchange and is currently on the stock exchange today. Transfer fees paid is very similar to Chelsea's, 921 net transfer fees, and then the club has paid significant wages, even though their wage to revenue percentage of 50% is much lower than Chelsea's 71%. Okay, there's been consistent growth in commercial revenue, and it's been instrumental in maintaining the club's operations pre and post financial fair play. Profit from the sale of players is relatively low compared to other clubs, as well as compared to Chelsea. Man United has not needed to change its business model. However, the fact that the club has not appointed a sporting director up until, I think the club appointed its first sporting director in 2021, and this might be a reason as to why their on-field success has not been as on-field success post-Ferguson has not been as good as other clubs that have changed their managers frequently. A point that I'll make that Dr. Parnell made in his work on sporting directors is that Man United actually operated when Ferguson was the manager. They didn't need a sporting director because essentially he himself and David Gill oversaw every aspect of the club's operations that a sporting director would actually do. And post Ferguson, the fact that they were not, they didn't get managers of that mold, and the fact that football has actually become more modern in terms of how operations are, and managers are not like Sir Alex Ferguson anymore, and that's one of the reasons why the club has not been as successful. So a cross-case analysis. I'm just going to be talking about debt. Both clubs have been financed by debt. Man United had significant interest payments and dividends. Financial fair play has impacted Chelsea's operations in terms of having to sell players for profit in order to finance, or rather to avoid sanctions and to finance their competitive strategy. Man United has been floated again on the stock market. Chelsea, in 1 year of Roman Abramovich taking over, appointed its first sporting director. Both clubs have similar income growths, even though the size of income is different, but in terms of growth, it's about 11% on average between 2003 and 2005 to 2021 for both clubs. However, for United, growing their income by 10% or by 11% is, because of the size of their income before the Glazers took over, is much more difficult than for Chelsea, whose income size was actually not that much. So even though they have similar growth rates in terms of income, United's has been more significant in absolute terms, and both clubs have had significant on-field success. So essentially what I've done is to look at the financing competitive strategy and financial management, and we've tried to introduce new developments in the literature, so things like financial regulation, managerial turnover, and then corporate governance, and then the role of the sporting director. And one of the conclusions that we're making from this paper is that clubs can actually have different business models, but what needs to be taken into cognizance is the historical success of the club. And with the new financial regulation introduced by UEFA, and Chelsea's business model of financing their players, financing their transfers through player sales, is something that any club can actually adopt. In fact, Chelsea, Manchester City, this transfer window has financed all of their transfer activities using revenue income from player sales. So that's one thing that we can draw out of this. So you can finance a club's competitive strategy and financial management by selling players, or you can actually go the route of Manchester United by growing the club's commercial revenue. So those are the conclusions that we have. So in terms of let me just go back to this, run this framework. What we're looking to do is to develop a flow chart that includes this new improvements, or rather developments in the literature, and just to essentially have a new framework that takes into consideration the new trends in football. So that's one of the next things that we're looking to do. I want to actually do a bit holistically. So questions and suggestions are welcome in this regard. I think that's the last slide. So thank you so much for attending, and please, I'm open to questions, comments that would help us to improve this paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Mobolaji. I'm just giving you a Teams round of applause, someone else did as well. So well done. Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. All sorts of things sprung to mind there. The thing that shocked me most was that I'd never realised that Glazer's takeover of United was as close to Abramovich's of Chelsea. I always thought Abramovich was around for a long time before Glazer turned up. But there you go. Funny how memory does that to you. I'm keen to let everyone else ask questions if they've got them. So the floor is open. If anyone has any questions, please do raise your hand. We've got the first question there. Ayulua, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, Balaji. Very, very insightful presentation. I think the divergence in strategy between Chelsea and Man U that you've shown, I think is something that definitely contributes to the literature. I think my question to you is maybe, but I don't know if it would be helpful for the paper. So it's more kind of looking forward. So obviously I know this analysis has kind of had a cutoff date, but do you think the current situation with Chelsea represents, the start of a new direction in terms of where the club is going? Because now we've seen that they've taken out what £800 million of debt now, and I suppose that this is not going to be like the one that you said Abramovich's debt, did not have any end date. So, and also you made a point that Chelsea financed a lot of their transfer activity recently from player sales. But this season, the transfer market is not closed yet. I just pulled up the data. I'm seeing here that they've only made 7 million from player outgoings, and they've already spent 167 million pounds. So, is this a pivotal point in terms of Chelsea then pursuing a different strategy from what they've done in different years because of change in management, or would they still be able to finance the activity to players? And now we know the whole story about the loan army in Chelsea and how the players come back and then they're able to pass them on. But are we seeing a different change in strategy?
Thank you for that question. So yes, to be honest, and no at the same time. Oh, well, yes, and I'm not sure at the same time. Yes, because I think I remember when the whole issue started, and I remember I tweeted that it'd be interesting to see what happens when the new owners take over.
You put yourself on mute, Mobolaji.
Okay, so sorry. Okay, yeah. I mean, I tweeted and I was wondering whether the new owners would retain Marina. And the reason why is that she was, I mean, it's very obvious that she was very instrumental in what the club has been able to do in terms of selling players, and it's evidenced by the fact that she was awarded the best director of football, and this is majorly because of her hard negotiations, and apparently she's known in the industry as someone who is very good in terms of negotiations. The fact that they haven't sold a lot of players this time around, I think it's owing to two things. One, the fact that there was a restriction on what they could do between March, when the ban happened, or when Roman Abramovich was sanctioned, and between then and when the transfer, or rather the sale, went through on the 30th of May. So what happened between that period was that Chelsea couldn't really plan for the future because there was a restriction on sales, restriction on new contracts, and because of that, I think that has disrupted what they have been able to do. Can the new ownership replicate what has been done in the past? I think only time will tell. I'm not sure how good they are at doing that. Todd really has actually focused a lot on buying players rather than selling players, and maybe it might just be something that would change over time. Why I said I'm not sure is because the fact that Chelsea is trying to improve their stadium tells you that they have recognized the fact that they cannot finance the club the way it was financed before, and maybe they're trying to grow their revenue. And I mean, it just makes a lot of sense because UEFA's new financial sustainability regulation is a bit tougher than, or rather, it takes into cognizance a lot of other things that financial fair play did not. So it's important for them to increase their revenue sources. So I don't know if that answers your question. So it'd be interesting to see what happens within the next year. And of course, I mean, he's just been there for, or rather being the sporting director for about less than four months. So it'd be difficult for me to say what strategy he's looking to adopt. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. Someone said Todd Bowley is playing Football Manager. Let's see how that plays out.
Great, thanks for the question and the response. Any more questions and comments from the audience? That was interesting that you mentioned Man City I didn't hear it before then, but I heard it in the conclusion, Mobolaji, and to me, obviously, the fact that you document two teams who have had a leaner, last 9 or 10 years or so, is testament to the fact that there's been Man City as an emergent threat over that time period. And I guess two kinds of thoughts to put out there. One is, to what extent is Man City's financial model similar to Chelsea's, both in terms of some of the origins of the funds, but the strategy that they've taken. Then also, do you feel it's possible to carry out an analysis like this in such a an environment like a competitive sports league, where what one club does has such a large externality and impact on what other clubs do? Is it possible to really exclude a team like that from an analysis like the one that you've done?
Thank you for that. Actually, I think what Man City is doing is a hybrid of what Chelsea and Man United has done, and that's actually a thought that I had in terms of how to look at it just beyond two clubs and to go a bit outside, so we can draw some inference from that. Man City has over the years ensured that they buy young and high quality players who have a resale value, and actually that's coming to fruition now. The fact that it made a lot of profit from sale of players. In terms of growing their commercial revenue, they have also grown their commercial revenue, even though there's a bit of what's the word? I mean, there's question marks as to question marks as to how, whether that has followed the regulations. But I mean, it's I mean, the fact that they have had on-field success, and when you have on-field success, it's easier for you to justify any commercial revenue. But I think one of the things, as you rightfully mentioned, it's actually possible to look at or to categorize clubs based on their business model, whether they are debt focused, commercial focused, and then to actually carry out econometric analysis and then look at success over the past 20 years. That's actually something that I'll take into consideration, and probably I'll send you an email if we can work on it together. But yeah, thank you. I think there's someone else's hand that is up.
Yes, Stefan's got his hand up.
Oh, Stefan.
Hi, Mobolaji. That's really, the first thing to say is just don't listen to James. Seriously, he says Chelsea's had a lean decade. They've won 2 Premier League titles and 2 Champions League titles. How is that lean? That's from an Oldham fan. I mean, what really is he talking about? I mean, so that's the first thing, first piece of advice. There's the second thing. One thing, seriously, you clearly have a lot of factual knowledge about this, and you've laid out the facts in great detail, which is always very useful. And you started out by talking about a number of theories from the literature about how clubs behave and so on. But one thing I was wondering is, what do you think what can your analysis tell us about the theories? What do they suggest, confirm, deny, reject theoretical results from the literature? What do you think?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think I'll start off first with the role of the sporting director. The fact that I mean, the literature is growing around the role of the sporting director, but one of the themes is that sporting directors are very important in situations where there's a lot of managerial changes, to bring stability to how a club is competitive and to ensure that a club's recruitment strategy is not focused on just or rather is not housed only on the manager, and to essentially be a bridge between the board and or what happens in the boardroom and on the field, to ensure that there's unison there. I think for Chelsea, one of the things that I can comment on that is that Chelsea, immediately after Roman Abramovich took over the club, appointed a sporting director. In fact, the appointment of their sporting director cost them about 6 million as far back as 2005, because Frank Arneson was gotten from Tottenham, and Tottenham, what's his name, and Daniel Levy, played hardball and didn't want them to sign him. And the fact that they've been able to get him, even though he left in, I think, 2011 and was replaced by someone else, the fact that they've had that role and their success has at no point did their success, go up or down. It's just been essentially constant, even though, I mean, a few times that they did not win the league. The point I'm trying to make is that having that role has actually confirmed what the literature says, that having that role stabilizes the club over time. For Manchester United, on the other hand, they haven't had a sporting director, and the first managerial change that happened under the Glazers has actually led the club to not being as successful over the years, and that's actually possibly linked to the fact that they haven't had that sporting director role. So that's one conclusion I can take from this study concerning the theory. Another thing that we can look at is how business model of football clubs have changed post financial fair play, and essentially business model of clubs that have not, or rather have had, in quotes, what the literature calls sugar daddy owners, rich wealthy benefactors. One of the things that the literature suggested is that the introduction of financial fair play would see a switch from clubs, or rather clubs that have that type of ownership. They will have to change their business model or get sanctioned. And Chelsea has actually changed their business model. And for clubs that had fairly, what I'll call natural income sources, wouldn't need to change their financial business model. So for example, Manchester United did not need to. I think those are two that that I just remember that I mentioned, that those are some of the things I can draw out from the case study.
So, one of the things I'd suggest is to try to formalize that a little bit more as you go forward, and say, right, try to actually write these down as specific hypotheses, and that can be, and what is the evidence that proves it one way or the other. Personally, I'm a little bit skeptical about the whole sporting director thing, just because it's just a title, it's just a name, and we don't really have theories about names changing anything, right? The question is what people do and how people act. And then there are managerial theories out there, and I think sometimes you need to go outside of the sports literature for this. So maybe that's a place to look at. There's a lot of theory about corporate governance out there, and this would probably be a very nice area at which to apply corporate governance theory, but not looking to what those of us who write inside the sports literature have done, but look outside of our literature and say, bring that in and say, well, what do they? How would you interpret how would a corporate governance expert interpret the meaning of a sporting director, and then try to work that through? Because I think that's very interesting. I think on the business model question, again, I have pretty firm opinions about this, and everyone disagrees with me anyway, so it doesn't matter. But I'm going to say my two penny worth anyway. So it just strikes me that so there's an argument to say, and I've argued this with UEFA, there's an argument to say that financial fair play changed next to nothing. And, exhibit 1 in my case is Manchester City. They just said, screw you, we're not doing this, and we'll take you to court, and they won. So did it really change anything? I don't think so. I think, in some sense, the Manchester United business model and the Chelsea business model were from day one different, and I'm sure you're perfectly well aware of this. The Glazers went in to suck money out, which they did brilliantly, and with extraordinary success. And Abramovich went in to win trophies because he was a gazillionaire, and he had winning, like football. So in that sense, they were always completely different, and it seems to me even up until recently, Abramovich has still been working that strategy, and the Glazers have still been working that strategy. But I think in some ways, to try to bring in some of these theories about why people own these assets would also help. So again, think about theories about amenity value, and why the motives for ownership. I think that would be a very useful way to start to frame some of this. And I think one of the things you probably need to do is you probably need to expand to 2 or 3 more clubs as well. You need to probably to do this. You probably need to bring in Manchester City. You probably need to bring in Liverpool, and probably Tottenham. You probably have to do the big 5 to make a coherent set of comparisons about these how these mega clubs behave.
Stefan, you said big 5, isn't it big 6? Before
Oh
you
yeah,
exclude him.
sorry. Oh God, yes. Sorry, Arsenal fans out there. You haven't had a now, James. If you're talking about underperforming in the last decade, there's your team, right? That's a much more credible argument there. But yeah,
I mean,
no, maybe big six. Yes, maybe. Who knows? Maybe big seven next year when, or 10 years time when Oldham get up there and. Or Big Eight when Oldham and Scunthorpe are up there fighting it out. That's the one we should be looking for, right?
Absolutely. The big two of the National League anyway, Oldham and Scunthorpe.
Yes.
On your point on financial fair play, I think that to a large extent, financial fair play, I mean, and I remember your paper on the nomenclature of financial fair play. I think to a large extent, where you mentioned or where you compared it with having a Ministry of Defense or Ministry of War, and then that nomenclature. I think it's quite important as to what financial fair play has done. The nomenclature, I think, to a large extent, did not did not represent in its entirety what UEFA was trying to do. I don't think financial fair play should have been named fair. It should have just been financial regulation, UEFA financial regulation, because that's essentially, when you look at the objectives, it was a financial regulation that was essentially looking to stop clubs from over investing and then limiting how much wealthy owners could introduce to the club, and also to reduce the debt levels. And I mean, if you look at Chelsea, for example, if you notice Chelsea's debt level got to about 1 billion before financial fair play, and essentially almost stayed that way throughout financial fair play. So Roman Abramovich wasn't introducing as much finances anymore. So I think in that regard, in terms of the financial aspect of things, I think I mean, relatively achieved its objectives. And then profitability, same thing with Chelsea. Chelsea's profitability got a bit better, marginally better, as opposed to what happened before. And UEFA's new regulation, that's the financial sustainability regulation. I think UEFA was very clear as to what it is. It's a sustainability regulation, which is why they have been able, or why they have introduced new variables, which to a large extent is looking to ensure that clubs are financially viable. I mean, time will tell what actually happens and whether it achieves its objectives. But I think in terms of the nomenclature, I think that was where there was an issue. But I mean, I remember the last roses that I presented at and on financial fair play, and your comments today reflect what happened then. So, but I mean, I agree with you. I defer to you on this note. But yeah.
One technical point I think you need to look at though here is on debt, which is you need to take account of soft debt. So I don't think Chelsea's debt position has changed at all. I think all that happened was that he renamed soft debt as equity, which is, that's like, my analogy is if a company takes out a loan from a related party, it's like lending money to yourself. Doesn't mean anything. You can say you've lent yourself money, but it's actually a meaningless transaction, right? Because you can't owe yourself money, you can't claim money back from yourself. There's no transaction, and that's what all these related party transactions are. So I actually think that from the financial statements, there's been next to no change in the real debt position of Chelsea, which is external debt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, Chelsea. I mean, during the Abramovich years, did not have any form of bank loans. So it was essentially equity, as you have rightfully mentioned, which is why I brought in trade creditors, because that's actually their real debt. So what they owe to other football clubs for transfer of players. So that's why I brought that in.
Okay.
Yes.
But I mean, hasn't trade creditors across the spectrum have gone up hugely, haven't they? Just because because they reflect transfer fees not yet settled, right? So
yes,
it's not. There's not a. I don't. I mean, I don't know. You could look at it, but my impression from the financial statements is that it actually hasn't. The indebtedness has not changed a lot relative to other teams, but
it actually has post financial fair play, and I think the reason why is that what clubs tried to do was to spread the cost of transfer fees over years, more in a bid to ensure their cash flow was adequate. So it has actually increased significantly. Let me just see if I can put that up. show what has happened for both clubs. Yes. So for Chelsea, I mean, beforehand, so let me just put up. For Chelsea, I mean, it was under 75 million. I think that was the highest in 2004. Or during financial fair play or post-financial fair play, it went as high as 180 something million. For Man United, similarly, it was below. I think the highest post or pre-financial fair play was about 60 something million. Post-financial fair play went as high as 250 something million. So it has actually gone up for both clubs post-financial fair play.
That's just the inflation in transfer fees, right? That's just
yes. So I mean,
nothing more.
Yeah.
Transfer fees have doubled in this period, more than doubled, right?
Yes, it has more than doubled, but if you look at it, it's more than doubled, right? But another thing that to look at is I looked at the actual in a second. I looked at, okay, so it has actually more than doubled, but increasingly. So for example, if you look at most transfer deals, you'd see that clubs have included things like variable consideration. So that while transfer fees have doubled, they have also incorporated new measures that actually delay when they actually make the payment. So it's actually both of them. You're right. There's the fact that transfer fee inflation has taken place, but there's also the fact that variable consideration and then spreading the cost over years has also been introduced. And a prime example is Barcelona and what Barcelona has done in terms of how much they owe players. I think up until now, even though they have sold Coutinho to Aston Villa, they still owe Liverpool for that transfer that took place as far back as I think 2017. So it just shows how long some of these clubs have tried to use this.
And also the profitability of Barcelona demonstrates the complete failure of financial fair play as well, right? I mean, they're bankrupt, as is Real Madrid. I mean, again, the success of the Premier League clubs is entirely down to broadcast rights, right? I mean, there's a staggering decade in terms of broadcast right fees inflation that they enjoyed, which has put them in way ahead of anybody else. And that's why they look profitable now. Nothing to do with financial fair play. And if you take the Premier League out of the financial fair play charts that UEFA like to show, clubs are as indebted as they were, they are as unprofitable as they were, they have, all of their financials, once you take out the Premier League, look just as bad as they were in 2010 before financial play came into account. And you can look at that, you can do that you can use the UEFA club licensing benchmarking reports to demonstrate that. It's not difficult to do.
Yeah, so I would say two things to that. While I mean the Premier League to a large extent has, I mean it before financial fair play was the greatest contributor to losses. Post financial fair play, greatest contributor to profitability. However, as you rightfully mentioned, broadcast revenue has gone up about 2,600% between 1992 to 2019. However, if you strip out the Premier League, because I think the Premier League and then some big clubs like Real Madrid and Barcelona are two extremes, right? So the Premier League has become more profitable. Those two clubs have become more loss-making. I think it's the clubs in between that actually shows the real impact of financial fair play. I think Dimitropoulos' study in 2021 actually looked at profitability in Italian league, and it shows that their profitability has actually gone up, even though it's a league that has very modest broadcast revenue. And one of the things that they noted is that clubs are more careful in managing their wage to revenue costs. So I think what it has introduced for the clubs that it has actually impacted positively, it has brought in rationality into their expenditure. I think there's another study by, I can't remember his name, in 2021 also, looking at the Russian Premier League. And one of the things that he has noted is that one of the things that study noted is that selling players for high profit has actually helped them to balance their financial statements. However, as you rightfully mentioned, those clubs in Italy, in in Russia actually sell a lot of their players to the Premier League. So essentially still the Premier League's broadcast revenue growth that has helped to balance it up. But I think what it has actually introduced financial fair play is introduced for some clubs, I mean, I'm excluding Barcelona in this my comments. It has helped them to realize that they need to be a bit financially or rather to have a 3-year perspective rather than the 1-year perspective. So essentially beforehand, clubs just thought about the next year. What finances do we need to remain successful the next year? But what financial fair play has done is to introduce a 3-year perspective for football clubs. The Barcelona case, to be honest, I'm as surprised as anyone else as to how things have happened. But I think I said to someone today that I think that I would like to see what happens in the next year and to see whether UEFA would be sanctioning them or investigating them, because UEFA financial fair play is retrospective. So it'd be interesting to see what happens there.
Well, let's write a paper on this sometime soon, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Right.
Great. Thanks, Stefan. And just to defend my point about Chelsea, I think Mobolaji's second table did have a slightly lower average league position in the last 10 years than the 10 years before that. I mean, it was third rather than first or something. But
Yes, James, you're right.
Any more questions and comments for Mobolaji? Well, impeccably timed. We will wrap up then and say thank you again, Mobolaji. A really interesting talk. Let's just do one more round of Teams applause for you. Did it happen? There we go. Hit it again. Anyway, we will break and we'll be back again next week when we will have Cornel Nisella from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. He's presenting how to reduce discrimination, evidence from a field experiment in amateur soccer. So we'll see you again this time next week, and I wish you all a fine weekend.
Thank you. Bye.